would fake documents. Women had quite a lot of work, which was quite dangerous.
Pilsudski's Polish legions grew in strength to 21,000. Although allied with the Germans and Austrians, their real goal was Polish independence.
Piłsudski and Polish Legion, it was a daily topic of conversation. All the other events, whether they were reports from the Western Front or from the Italian front, one way or another, they were interpreted from a point of view of the Polish future.
On the 5th of August, 1915, German forces took the city of Warsaw from the Russians. Among the soldiers in the German armed forces were thousands of Poles. German Prince Leopold of Bavaria took the salute.
Eigentlich merkte man das wenig, kein Hass.
There was no hatred between the Poles and the Germans. There was too much suffering then. The Poles also had to go to war. Every family suffered. In every house there was a son to be mourned. The pity of shared suffering prevailed.
November 1916. In territory seized from the Russians, the Germans established what they called the Kingdom of Poland. It was a phantom state. There was no monarch. The kingdom's task was to support the German war effort. Pilsudski was disappointed, but agreed to become a military leader in the puppet kingdom. Many Poles accused him of opportunism.
He was like a man near breaking point. He was having quite a tough time. First, internal trouble with Polish people who were of different opinions, and then the fight with the Germans and the Austrians. So he had two things weighing on him.
Pilsudski had predicted that a great war would topple the Romanov Tsars of Russia. In February 1917, his premonition was fulfilled. The army and people of Russia ousted the Tsar from power. Thousands of Poles joined in the Russian celebration.
The Tsar had fallen. This meant freedom. We went out on the streets of Moscow singing patriotic songs like The Day of Blood and Glory. The February Revolution and the fall of the Tsar was something very joyous. Then came the time of Kerensky. He loved to talk, and talked a lot. We were a little under his spell. He promised Poland independence.
Soon, another Pilsudski prophecy came true. For 3 years, the American Congress and President Woodrow Wilson had kept the United States out of the war. Hoping to act as mediator, Wilson appealed for peace without victory. But the Germans stepped up their war at sea. They planned an alliance with Mexico and Japan. On April 6, 1917, Wilson declared war on Germany. That July, Joseph Pilsudski refused to swear an oath of allegiance to the German Kaiser. He and most of his legions were imprisoned. In April, the Germans had helped the communist Lenin return in secret to his native Russia, hoping he would start uprisings against the pro-Western government there. In October, Lenin's Bolsheviks overthrew the liberal government of Alexander Kerensky. The Bolsheviks, too, promised freedom to the submerged nations of the Tsar's old empire.
1917 is a year most important for the development of the First World War in general, but especially for Poland. In 1917, Russia suffered the Second Revolution, and in fact was plunged in the revolution to such an extent that it ceased to be counted as an ally of the Entente powers.
After the collapse of its Russian ally, France embraced the cause of Polish independence with vigor. Pilsudski's old foe, Roman Dmowski, persuaded the Allies to form a Polish army in the West. From France, Canada, and America came more than 50,000 Polish immigrants who hoped to march into Poland with the advancing Allied armies. But Dmowski and the army were still in France when Germany sued for peace. On November 10, 1918, the Germans released Joseph Pilsudski from prison and rushed him to Warsaw. There he would forge a new Polish state.
It began exactly on November 11, 1918, when we, schoolboys, members of a secret military organization, were mobilized in order to disarm German units, which at that time occupied the town of Częstochowa, where I was a pupil in local high school. Well, that's the first time I got a gun. And these German soldiers from whom I took this gun was very kind to me and told me, look, I have enough of this instrument, and now you may take it.
Washington, D.C., November 1918. The end of a world war is celebrated in the streets. The leader of what was now the most powerful nation on earth, Woodrow Wilson, left the United States for a Europe that lay in ruins. The war had claimed approximately 15 million lives. Wilson was determined that such a catastrophe would never again cloud the earth. He planned to form a League of Nations, pledged to the rule of international law. His principal allies were the British, led by Lloyd George, and the French, headed by Georges Clemenceau. Clemenceau and all the Allied leaders favored the creation of a new Polish state. But what sort of Poland? Czechs, Germans, Lithuanians, Ukrainians all sought territory the Poles claimed as theirs. In Lvov, there was bloodshed between Poles and Ukrainians.
I approached the young Ukrainian officer and I asked him, well, what's all the shooting about? And he told me, well, there's nothing about except that this is now our land. This is Ukrainian Republic.
We received news that Ukrainians organized a kind of uprising in the city of Lvov, which was Polish and is a great tradition in our history. It was one of the frontiers town, always exposed, to attacks by Tatars, by Russians and so on.
Our home and our family was unfortunately on the Ukrainian part of the city, next to the old Austrian fortress called Citadella, and we were too darn close to it, and because of that unpleasant neighborhood, we were getting all kind of bullets from Ukrainian side and from Polish side as well.
I approached very close to this window and I saw on the floor more or less 10 people sleeping. So I prepared my iron. It was very heavy, so-called defensive hand grenade. It was burst and all these windows went out, and I think either these people were killed or wounded, but two managed to escape, with guns in their hands, looking for enemy. So, as I was instructed, I shot them.
My father never showed any emotion. He was too, I don't know how to describe it, but he was very, very stingy in showing his emotions. And that particular day when I yelled to him, "Daddy, Daddy," the whole wolf is in Polish hands. He didn't say a word. Just an army gave me a big hug. And this was the first, the last time in my life when I saw him cry.
Of course, we both later on began to deliberate this problem of killing, you know, because the first time in our life it happened. It was not nice experience, of course, but we came to inevitable, in our own opinion, conclusion that it's our job. Job has to be done. We have to defend city of Lvov, and that is why we are supposed to shoot at Ukrainians, and Ukrainians want to capture city of Lvov. They will shoot us, you know. In war, it's normal.
Thousands of Jews also lived in Lvov. Most of them took no part in the battle. In the aftermath of the fighting, approximately 370 people, including 70 Jews, were killed by Polish troops. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas had been imprisoned and then murdered by the Bolsheviks. The German Kaiser had abdicated and retired to Holland. In Germany, the Communist Party urged an international revolution. A workers' Soviet was established in Berlin, then crushed. Its leaders, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, were murdered. In Poland, Pilsudski, who had been a socialist, stated,
"Comrades, I rode on the red-painted tramcar of socialism as far as the stop called Independence, but there I alighted. I don't care about rightists or leftists. I've had them up my arse. I'm for everyone. I care only about a government which can give Poland what she requires."
Elections were held to form the new Polish government. The left received a third of the votes. Right-wing supporters of Roman Dmowski received slightly more. As head of state and commander-in-chief, Pilsudski chose concert pianist Ignacy Paderewski as a non-party prime minister.
There was an unending crowd of people. He came from the castle in a carriage drawn by white horses. And we cheered, "Long live Pilsudski." No one near us shouted, "Long live Paderewski." Just, "Long live Pilsudski." And Pilsudski saluted.
Paderewski was dispatched to Paris, where a Polish national committee led by Roman Dmowski still claimed to be the authentic voice of Poland. Paderewski's task was to win the committee's loyalty to the government in Warsaw. But Dmowski was convinced that with Allied support, he could shape a better Poland.
Dmowski, who was a very good French and English speaker, spoke to the great 3 or 4 masters of the world. In 5 hours, he explained his plan.
In Paris, the French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, was playing host to scores of nationalities who were lobbying the Allied peace conference. Britain's Lloyd George declared,
"The war of the giants has ended. The quarrels of the pygmies have begun."
Said President Wilson,
People will endure their tyrants for years, but they tear their deliverers to pieces if a millennium is not created immediately.
the Great War was over, but fighting continued in many places. In Russia, the Bolsheviks, the Reds, were fighting a civil war with the Whites, a coalition of anti-communists. In the Ukraine, a bloody struggle for power continued between Ukrainian nationalists, Bolsheviks, and Poles.
First time I heard about Polish and Bolshevik fights was in February 1919. There were still fights, of course, in the immediate surrounding of Lvov between Ukrainians and Poles, but we had already the official free press, and from that press I got the news about the fighting.
in one day, I remember there were 19 attacks back and forth. The Bolsheviks with the Poles. They used to run out of the house. Some of them came back, some of them didn't come back.
In France, Clemenceau declared that his government would rather resign than have the Bolshevik monsters at the Paris Peace Conference. The principal concerns of the great powers were to prepare a treaty with Germany, to set up the League of Nations, and to redraw a tidier, more civilized map of Europe. On that map, Poland's borders had yet to be drawn.
I had the privilege to sit at lunch with Professor Romer, the expert on geography, and Václav Babinski, a diplomat, his wife, born a countess, a very self-willed, pretty woman who fascinated me because she took me on shopping trips, and I was fascinated by Les Parfums de Guerlain and the enormous hats on which I was spending my scarce earnings as translator.
Polish Prime Minister Paderewski proved a popular and charming diplomat, countering the extreme nationalism and anti-Semitism of Roman Dmowski. The Polish army Dmowski had organized with General Haller was still in France. The Allies kept it there for 6 months after the war, fearing it might be used against the Ukrainians or Jews, or to seize the German port of Danzig. It was April 1919 before the Allies let it leave.
It was a bright day. And all of a sudden there was a crowd around, and looking, I sort of pushed into the crowd to see what was going on. And there was a sheikhet. Those were the people that came to slaughter for kosher meats. And there were 2 halerchikas around him, and one held his beard and a knife in the other hand, and there was blood gushing from him. There were a lot of people around, but there wasn't anybody that protested.
As nationalist passions grew, so did animosities between ethnic groups. Pilsudski was firmly opposed to anti-Semitism and committed to a multi-ethnic state, but arguments over Polish national identity inflamed the populace. Many wanted the ethnic Poles to dominate the country. Others disagreed. They believed in Poland as a land of cultural variety. Pilsudski himself was born near Wilno, a mixed Polish, Lithuanian, and Jewish city. In April 1919, Wilno was taken by the Polish army from local Bolsheviks. Pilsudski promised to govern without reference to race or creed. He ignored edicts from the great powers which prohibited the seizure of disputed territory by force. He set out to reclaim traditionally Polish territories together with their minority populations. The British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, was highly critical. On the other hand, Georges Clemenceau, having lost his Russian ally, thought a strong Poland might help contain German power. An independent Poland had been one of President Wilson's war aims. He backed Polish claims for Silesia and the German port of Danzig, Gdansk. But during the Paris conference, he grew cautious. The British Foreign Office warned that giving Danzig to Poland would create instability and, in their words, probably render the Polish position untenable if and when Germany recovers.
Was in fact always opposing, you see, the important demand of Dmowski. Gdańsk or Danzig must be Polish port without any control, because otherwise you are not free.
The Great War ended with ceremonies and treaties, but disputes remained. In Paris, Poland claimed Lvov, so did the Ukrainians. Poland claimed Vilna, so did the Lithuanians. Poland claimed Teschen, so did the Czechs. Poland claimed Silesia and Danzig, so did the Germans. At the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was humbled, forced to cede territory and make huge reparations payments. Poland, too, had to compromise. The treaty declared Danzig a free city. It declared that the future of Silesia would be determined by plebiscite. The Allies insisted that Poland sign a treaty guaranteeing the rights of its minorities. Its eastern boundaries were to be subject to international review. While the conference recognized Poland's existence, its final shape and form were still undecided. Clemenceau of France, Wilson of the United States, Lloyd George of Britain, and Orlando of Italy had completed their business at Versailles. The world's mightiest peace conference was over. In retrospect, it would prove to have shortcomings. Some of its measures too severe, others too vague. The great leaders departed, leaving issues of detail unresolved. The Bolsheviks dismissed the Paris Peace Conference as an act of capitalist exploiters. Units of the Red Army were moving westward. They claimed that true peace in Europe would come only with the overthrow of capitalism. In the hinterland between Russia and Poland, more villages were coming under Bolshevik control.
Our population had very few Poles. Most of them were Jewish, Belarusian, White Russian, some Ukrainians. At that time, believe me, they didn't know a thing from communism or socialism at present. They were illiterate. They couldn't even write.
Pilsudski wanted to create a buffer between Poland and Russia, a federation of states free from Russian domination and dependent on Poland for survival. In the spring of 1920, such hopes looked dim. The Bolsheviks were advancing deep into the Ukraine.